Tonight at 10, chaos on all fronts for Liz Truss. The Home Secretary resigns and party discipline breaks down in the Commons. Suella Braverman is out as Home Secretary. She admits breaking the rules on official communications, but she also criticises Liz Truss. In her resignation letter, she accuses the government of losing direction and of breaking promises to voters. In the Commons tonight, chaos and confusion in a vote on fracking, revealing the depth of anger among some Conservative MPs.
I hope all those people that put Liz Truss in number 10, I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the ministerial red box. I hope it was worth it to sit round the cabinet table, because the damage they have done to our party is extraordinary.
A weak Prime Minister flailing from one crisis to the next, and a big, blunt question tonight. Is this a government in its death spiral?
Is this your last Prime Minister's questions?
Earlier, the Prime Minister had been fighting off renewed demands to step down after the collapse of the mini-budget.
Economic credibility gone. And her supposed best friend, the former Chancellor, he's gone as well. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
Mr. Speaker, I am a fighter and not a quitter.
We'll have the latest on a day of never-ending confusion at Westminster, as well as more alarming news on the cost of living. Food prices are increasing at the highest rate for 40 years. That's a major reason why inflation has risen to above 10%. The failings of maternity services in East Kent. An independent report says dozens of babies might have survived with better care. And we have a special report from the front line in Ukraine, as President Putin declares martial law in those areas occupied by Russia.
On BBC London, sky-high rent, the Londoners paying an increasing proportion of their wages for housing, and a warning that carers could be heading into debt as the cost of living bites.
Good evening. We've come to the northeast of England, to the city of Sunderland, to talk about the very sharp rise in the cost of living. All of this on a day of unrelenting chaos for Prime Minister Liz Truss and her government. Earlier this evening, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, left her job, and in her resignation letter, she admitted making a mistake by sending an official document from her personal email. But her letter then went much further, accusing Liz Truss of breaking promises to voters and of losing direction. Grant Shapps is the new Home Secretary, the fourth in the space of 4 years. That, of course, underlining the sense of political instability, which then got worse in the Commons this evening with a huge row about a vote on fracking, and until just a few moments ago, confusion over whether the Conservative Chief Whip and her deputy were still in their posts. We're now told that they are. Well, for the latest, let's join our political editor, Chris Mason, at Westminster.
Huw, tonight Conservative MPs are open-mouthed in horror at what they are witnessing. A government just 6 weeks old that has already junked the vast majority of its programme and removed a Chancellor in a day of complete chaos. At lunchtime, a senior advisor to the Prime Minister suspended over allegations of briefing against Conservative MPs. Shortly after Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister, due on a trip outside London, cancelled hastily so she could meet the now former Home Secretary, and a resignation was to follow. And then this evening, complete confusion. The government attempting, in a show of strength, to compel its MPs to vote with it on the issue of fracking, a vote of confidence to try and ensure that MPs would back Liz Truss. At the last minute, an admission of weakness, it was no longer to be that vote. And yet nobody in Parliament could quite be certain what was going on. And for several hours this evening, Downing Street couldn't tell us whether there'd been further resignations as a result. What a day. Tonight at Westminster, rolling case studies in chaos. Crises engulfing the government by the hour. The Home Secretary resigns. Those at the highest level in government don't even know if others have followed her. At tea time, a man who was rebelling against Liz Truss just days ago was appointed by her as Home Secretary.
I accept that the government has obviously had a very difficult period. What I do know is there's a very important job to do. People expect their government to ensure there is security for them. The Home Office is at the heart of that in so many different ways. It's a great office of state. I'm obviously honoured to do that role.
How long can the Prime Minister last?
Never mind the Prime Minister, well, for now at least. It's Suella Braverman who's gone. This was her yesterday. Today, she's out. Out because this morning she sent an official document from her personal email account, a breach of the rules. In a zinger of a resignation letter to the Prime Minister, Suella Braverman wrote, "Pretending we haven't made mistakes, carrying on as if everyone can't see that we have made them, and hoping that things will magically come right is not serious politics. I have made a mistake. I accept responsibility. I resign." She continues, "I have concerns about the direction of this government. Not only have we broken key pledges that were promised to our voters, but I have had serious concerns about this government's commitment to honouring manifesto commitments." Last month, Suella Braverman was promoted to one of the great offices of state. She cheered on a Prime Minister in trouble at the party conference. Today, she becomes the shortest-serving Home Secretary since the Second World War. All that after a summer in which she pitched to be Prime Minister herself.
Don't vote for me because I'm a woman. Don't vote for me because I'm brown. Vote for me because I love this country and because I would do anything for it.
A hellish week for Liz Truss has got worse. Earlier, she had to endure a Prime Minister's question time loaded with humiliation.
A book is being written about the Prime Minister's time in office. Apparently, it's going to be out by Christmas. Is that the release date or the title?
I have been in office for just under 2 months, and I have delivered the energy price guarantee. I've reversed the national insurance increase. Mr. Speaker, that is more of a record of action than the honourable gentleman in his 2.5 years in the job.
The Prime Minister defiant, the Labour leader said she'd crashed the economy, put people's bills up and was now cutting spending. And he said she'd ditched everything she'd stood for.
45p tax cut, gone. Corporation tax cut, gone. 20p tax cut, gone. 2-year energy freeze, gone. Economic credibility, gone. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
The Prime Minister stands up, the folder is slammed down, and Liz Truss insisted,
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
But what policies will survive given the new Chancellor's looking over all sorts of promises? News from the Prime Minister, the state pension will rise in line with spiralling prices after all.
Can the Prime Minister perhaps turn to our Chancellor right now, get permission to make another U-turn and commit to raising the state pension at the rate of inflation?
Prime Minister.
We will maintain the triple lock, and I am completely committed to it. So is the Chancellor.
Tonight, the next flashpoint. A vote on fracking, drilling into the land to extract gas, was turned by Downing Street into a serious test of loyalty in the government itself.
Division! Clear the lobby!
Compelling Conservatives to back it or face being kicked out of the parliamentary party. A weak government attempting a show of strength and then, seemingly, changing its mind. In the voting lobbies, confusion. Tory MPs not even knowing the consequence for them of their vote. And afterwards, this extraordinary allegation from a Labour MP.
I saw members being physically manhandled into another lobby and being bullied.
While crying.
If we want to stand up against bullying in this House of our staff, we have to stop bullying in this chamber as well, don't we?
We will have a little bit of good behaviour for a moment on both sides of the House.
The MP, who it was suggested was manhandled, said he'd had what he described as a frank and robust conversation. Some Conservative MPs then told the BBC the chief whip in charge of party discipline had resigned, livid at the chaos over whether this was a vote of confidence in the government or not. And then watch this, a senior cabinet minister who didn't know what was going on.
I'm not entirely clear on what the situation is with the chief whip. There has been an element of confusion over whether the vote was a confidence vote or not.
Tory MPs cannot believe the dysfunction they're witnessing.
I think it's a shambles and a disgrace. I think it is utterly appalling.
So you seem quietly...
I'm livid. And, you know, I really shouldn't say this, but I hope all those people that put Liz Truss in number 10, I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the ministerial red box. I hope it was worth it to sit round the cabinet table, because the damage they have done to our party is extraordinary.
What's happening with the chief whip? There was a great victory today. Chief whip, great credit to her.
Tonight, many senior Conservatives gathered at a private members' club.
Is it right to be having champagne while the government's collapsing, Sir Graham?
They don't know, we don't know how long this government has left. After a day like today, its life expectancy has shortened further.
Well, let's join Chris once again at Westminster. And Chris, can we come to the Prime Minister's own position in a moment? I'd like to ask you, first of all, given all the problems facing the country and lots of people watching, thinking about the problems that they're facing with the cost of living, all the things they look to the government to take decisions on, is this government functioning in any meaningful way?
No, is the short answer. It is utterly dysfunctional, and we're seeing that playing out hour by hour, and we've seen it in just the last couple of hours. Just at the end of my report there, you saw this confusion that there's been over whether the chief whip, the person responsible for discipline, there isn't any discipline at the moment within the Conservative Party, was even in her job. And a Conservative MP watching our bulletin tonight texting me whilst we were watching my report, saying that he learnt that there'd been a change of mind from the government as to whether or not that was a confidence vote or not 10 minutes before it happened, leaving the chief whip responsible for discipline completely isolated, and hence all of this confusion as to whether or not she was leaving the government. But that's a micro example. It's a case study in this broader chaos. And as you say, Huw, the reason it matters is not because of the soap opera in this postcode. It's not about ministers coming and going, as important as that is of itself. It's about whether a government can function at a time where a country needs a government to function, because all of the problems that we report on every night and you'll be hearing from Sunderland. And right now, the simple truth is this government isn't functioning. It's as simple as that.
And if it's not functioning, Chris, of course, we come on to the question of leadership and what is happening with the Prime Minister, given that clearly she's had to deal with several setbacks today and problems to do with ministers and others. Can I ask the blunt question, can she survive in the post?
It looks increasingly difficult for her to survive at any length of time. That's the judgment of people observing like me, but also the judgment of senior Conservatives who simply cannot bring themselves to defend what is going on any longer. Now, what's interesting is the Prime Minister today, actually at Prime Minister's questions, before much of the chaos that followed had even begun, performed perhaps as well as you could expect, given the situation that she found herself in. And what we were beginning to get was an argument from her and those still publicly loyal to her that despite everything, and I know this sounds ludicrous, but that she represents stability, because the alternative to stability is another Prime Minister being dreamt up in a dark room in Westminster, or a general election. Well, we've seen how that stability argument has played out today. It was probably quite a weak argument to start with. It's an even weaker one in the light of events today. And so the big question being widely asked here tonight is whether Liz Truss can survive for even a few more days, let alone longer than that. This is a very, very difficult spot for her to escape from.
Chris, many thanks. We'll return for a word before the end of the programme. But for now, thank you, Chris Mason, our political editor, with his thoughts at Westminster. All of this happening on a day of worrying economic news. And we are here in Sunderland to report on the impact of that. We're at the National Glass Centre, this very impressive structure, which is part of the rich industrial heritage of this region. And with all of this around us, just reflect on the fact that the news is that the rate of inflation is back in double figures to its highest level in 40 years. The rate, as measured by the Consumer Prices Index, rose to 10.1% last month. The main cause is the sharp rise in the cost of food and drink, now running at an annual 14.5%. That's a rate not seen since 1980. Bread and cereals, meat, milk, cheese, eggs, all more expensive, though petrol prices have been falling. Now, the Bank of England has warned that overall inflation could reach 13% by the end of the year, and it's therefore expected that interest rates will be rising again to try to control that. And there's a reason why September's inflation figure is really important, and that's because it is the figure that is used to calculate the rise in the state pension and welfare benefits come next April. Now, our economics editor, Faisal Islam, has been speaking to households and businesses here in Sunderland about the cost of living crisis.
It is the 14th month of relentlessly rising food prices. And it's no surprise here at Mickey's Place, a food bank and warm space in a church in Usworth on the edge of Sunderland. A long march up of inflation, a hit to the cost of living, a rise in food prices not seen for 42 years.
We are trying to provide as much help and support to this community as possible, but the cost of living is just really to a situation where people just cannot cope. So yes, we laugh with them and we cry with them.
And the government says it's trying to help with energy bills, and
we don't see it down here.
This is one area where the official figures lag behind everyday experiences at grocery tills and the increasing number of households, some working, who now need help with the most basic of necessities, food and warmth.
Everything's going up.
Can you even imagine some of the prices you're facing in the grocers right now?
Oh, butter is a luxury now for most people, I would think.
Yeah.
It really is.
We come to somewhere like this, which is a godsend, where we can have a hot meal, we can sit beside a nice warm radiator.
You literally buy the radiator?
That's right, yes, It's a nice warm radiator.
Yeah. What is it? So you're here because it'll save you having to...
That's right, it saves a lot from home. It saves a lot of cooking at home, which costs more money. The food bill alone, it come down because we come here.
Food prices are now up 14.5% in a year. That's the highest annual rate since 1980, the second highest since 1977. Some milk prices are up 42% over a year, eggs up 22%, and jam is up 28%. Charlie has just taken over something of a Sunderland institution, the Muller Bakery in Hendon. A time of record rises in energy prices, imported food ingredient prices, and high business rates too are a recipe to make him consider closing one of their 3 outlets.
Literally every ingredient that we use has went up drastically. Some days, or weeks, we get reports of how much things are going up, and we'll get in, say for instance, we buy a box of fondant icing and it's going up 60% from one week to the next, and that's we can't just put our prices up 60% because people just won't pay it, so it hits us really hard.
As everyone awaits the Halloween budget from Jeremy Hunt, it is the broad-based nature of price rises, food, energy and services, that's a little scary. inflation at this time matters, as it normally forms the basis for minimum rises in state pensions and benefits. But this morning, that had been in doubt, as the Chancellor looks to save money. Back at the food charity, some relief and bewilderment for Betty.
It fills you with dread. Yeah. Because are we going to have to start and live on what little bit we've got saved, and what happens when that's gone? Yeah. Where do we go from there?
Well, I think we've just heard the Prime Minister the government having said that it might not do that, have now decided that, well, they will put it up with the rate of inflation. What do you make of that?
That's today. What happens tomorrow? They could change their minds by tomorrow, because every day they change their mind.
So pensioners are spared eventually, but others could face the price squeeze from a government trying to find savings.
And Faisal joins me now live in the National Glass Centre. We heard about the economic uncertainty there, all those people you spoke to, and of course the political chaos we reported on earlier. You put these two things together, where's that heading?
Well, first, there's an obvious disconnect, isn't there, between people really struggling with the cost of living crisis, working people clinging onto heaters because they can't afford to turn on the heating at home, and chaos in the place that should be helping sort it out in the government. But step back from this, the big picture, I think, is that we had that reverse budget on Monday and the Chancellor trying to reassure the markets, but there was a flip side to that, which is less reassurance for those people dependent on government spending. And that means lots of political instability, because difficult decisions are required. And actually the Home Secretary's resignation was in part motivated by this, because the number 10 wanted to get more foreign workers in, because that helps with growth and makes some of those difficult decisions less. And that was one of the difficulties, we understand. But then you look at the people that I reported on here, and you look at the other political difficulties. You had the vicar there, who said, when I said, why are you saying the government's not helping you? There are tens of billions of pounds helping with the energy bills. She said, well, £2,500 typical bills, that's already unthinkable. So if you saved a bit more than that, people won't notice the difference. Betty there, when I told her that her pension was going to go up by that 10%, she said, well, is there going to be another U-turn? Then if you're a business, this is a famous area of exports, the only area of export surplus in the UK to the European Union. Do they know what the certainty is from government? So businesses need certainty, people need certainty, and the difficulty might be if there's a sort of pass the parcel of instability from the markets into politics, might it go back into the markets again?
Okay, Faisal, many thanks again. Faisal Islam, our economics editor, there with his thoughts, and more analysis from Faisal and the rest of our economic team and political team, as well as our very popular £1 family recipe plan. It's all there for you on the BBC News website, bbc.co.uk/news, and you can access it as well on the BBC News app. So let's turn to one of the day's other main stories. It's estimated that as many as 45 babies might have survived had they received better care at East Kent NHS Hospitals Trust. That's one of the findings of an independent review which looked at more than 200 cases at the Trust between 2009 and 2020. It said the hospitals often provided care that was suboptimal and led to significant harm. Our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan, first reported on these concerns over 2 years ago, and he's followed the story of many of the families.
We are living in the 5th largest economy in the world, and women and children are dying here as if we lived in a remote village.
Helen Gittis and Kelly Rudolph were colleagues at Kent University before bereavement made them friends. In 2016, Kelly's daughter Celandine died aged 5 days. 2 years earlier, Helen's daughter Harriet was just 8 days old when she died. Today, the two mothers learned how bad the maternity care had been that they and many others received.
It felt like a vindication that all of the things that we thought were wrong, that our judgments about the failings that we had suffered were real failings.
It felt very truthful in that way.
It felt truthful, absolutely.
The blaming of mothers for what happened to their children, and that is something that comes out very strongly in the report as something that is not terribly special or unusual, but is so hard to deal with.
The report found that with basic maternity care, the outcome could have been different for 45 babies who died. Dozens more injuries to mothers and babies were also preventable. The errors were due to failures in team working, professionalism, compassion and listening. But despite this, there was a culture of denial at the Trust and a resistance to change.
There was a cover-up. What I don't think was that it was a planned cover-up. I think it was just the way that everybody found themselves behaving. They reinforced each other in that behaviour, sure, but I don't believe that it was a conscious plot. A cover-up, very definitely, and people were denied truths that they deserved to great personal detriment.
While most births at the Trust are healthy, the inquiry found that cliques and egos among staff prevented good teamwork, that babies' deaths were dismissed as God's will. Over the 11 years they investigated, the teams said they could find no discernible improvements in care. Today the Trust apologised unreservedly for their failures.
These families came to us expecting that we would care for them safely, and we failed them. We must now learn from and act on this report.
The Trust have promised to make improvements, but today's report says a system for monitoring the maternity performance of all trusts nationwide needs adopting. For these two friends, however, the publication is a moment of both clarity and reflection.
They'd known for more than 6 years by the time our daughter was born that there were problems, and yet we suffered because they refused to learn.
I really want this to be a moment when I can actually begin to think about my daughter and to miss her.
The death of Harry Richford in 2017, aged just 7 days, contributed hugely to the inquiry being set up. In particular, his grandfather Derek uncovered serious failings, pressurising politicians to act.
Have you had time to reflect on how well you as a family have represented his voice over the past few years?
I would like to think that we as a family have done Harry proud.
Harry Richford only lived for a week, but if today's report leads to meaningful maternity improvements, countless families he'll never meet will have reason to thank him. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Kent.
President Putin has announced heightened security measures across Russia, including the annexed Crimea, and declared martial law in the 4 unlawfully occupied regions of Ukraine. The move in the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions allows the stopping of people's movement, forced labour for defence purposes, and the confiscation of property. The new general in charge of the Russian invasion has admitted that the situation for his troops remains tense. In Kherson, the Russian forces have started moving civilians as Ukrainian troops on the counter-offensive are closing in. And in the east, Ukrainian troops have also recaptured thousands of miles of territory. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale and cameraman Lee Durant have been with the Ukrainian forces on the front line as they advance east of the city of Liman. A warning, there are some distressing images in the report.
The road of retreat, a dead end for some, where these Russian forces met their own Armageddon. The carcasses of armour and bloated dead bodies scatter the ground of the recently liberated east. A village, the new front line for these Ukrainian troops. Still within range of Russian artillery, the signature sound of this war. Russian positions are just 500 meters away. You can see they're telling us to get down here. Come on, let's go. But this war also involves close quarters combat, as we're about to find out. Okay, let's get down. Okay. A grenade's fired into the tree line. from where the Russians were firing as we make a speedy exit.
Let's get out. Let's get out.
Okay.
Okay, we're getting out of here. Some small arms fire, probably from a Russian scouting party, so they've been telling us to get out of here, back to the main headquarters.
Russian forces have been trying to outflank them. Many of these troops only volunteered at the start of the war. Months of fighting has transformed them into a professional army. But these counterattacks are slowing their advance. Vladimir, their captain, tells me they need more armour and they're waiting for reinforcements. The push east is testing supply lines. With most bridges blown, Ukraine's had to rely on amphibious craft and boats to keep feeding the front line. They've only just completed the construction of this new crossing. And there are other obstacles too, countless Russian minefields that need to be cleared. Ukraine is still advancing, but it's getting harder. Jonathan Beale, BBC News, Donbass.
The turmoil there in Ukraine, Jonathan Beale reporting. Let's have more on tonight's main story, the turmoil at Westminster. Let's rejoin our political editor, Chris Mason. We know, Chris, of course, from your report earlier, there have been gatherings of MPs during the evening. Do you have any sense of what tomorrow might bring?
I think in summary, Huw, bottling and burying this chaos is now going to prove nigh on impossible. All of the conversation among Conservative MPs is what to do, given the scale of the situation the party, the government finds itself in. Let me read you the reflections of one very senior Conservative speaking to me tonight. Unforgivable, terrible, appalling. She, a reference to the Prime Minister, has stuffed the party, the country, and there's likely to be a general election. I must say it wasn't actually the word stuffed that they used. An additional contribution from this figure: how could the Prime Minister act like a little dictator without a mandate? So the Conservative Party is asking itself very big questions tonight about what it does and how soon it might depose a Prime Minister. And then what happens next? Can they find another one? Who might it be? And does it mean that there's a general election? There's chaos already, it's likely to get more chaotic.
Chris, again, thanks very much for the final word there at Westminster tonight. Chris Mason, our political editor. Let's, before we go, catch up with the weather and let's join Ben. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Huw. Thank you. Good evening. Angry skies off the Cornish coast earlier on this evening, ahead of some really heavy downpours and thunderstorms that have been pushing in. You can see these on the earlier radar picture. They've been working up from the southwest and they will continue to move northeastwards as we head through the night. So these bands of showers moving quite erratically northwards across England, Wales, Northern Ireland, up into Scotland. Could see some fog patches developing across some western parts later in the night as the winds ease a little, but it will be a mild start to tomorrow morning, but a really wet start for some, and it looks like some of the heaviest rain is likely to be across southeast England, East Anglia, into the East Midlands, Lincolnshire moving up into Yorkshire, but some of this rain getting into parts of East Wales, even the West Country. Northern Ireland is going to have a much drier day than it had today, and some sunshine into the afternoon, but all the while this lump of really heavy rain will hug the North Sea coast, really focusing in on northeast England and southeast Scotland. Winds a little lighter than they were today, and actually where we see some sunshine developing in the south, you can see 18 there on the chart. I wouldn't be at all surprised if somewhere got to 20 degrees. Now, all of this turbulent weather is thanks to this huge area of low pressure really dominating the scene at the moment. The isobars packing together as we go into Friday. That means it'll be a windier day on Friday, particularly around some of these western coasts. We'll see further showers and thunderstorms drifting northwards, longer spells of rain, still some spells of sunshine and feeling relatively warm in that sunshine. In fact, East Anglia could see highs of 21 degrees. I think the weekend is best summed up like this. There'll be some drier interludes, but still the chance of some outbreaks of rain at times. That's all from me, Huw.
Ben, many thanks once again. And that is BBC News at 10 from Sunderland on an extraordinary day which brought worrying news on the economy for households and for businesses, and renewed chaos as we've seen at Westminster for Liz Truss and her government. The news continues here on BBC One. It's time to join our colleagues in the nations and the regions. But from us at the National Glass Centre in Sunderland, thanks for watching and good night.